What if I told you that some of the most important battles in Native American history were fought not against people, but against a silent, icy enemy? Winter on the Great Plains and in the forests of the Northeast was a time of trial, when survival depended not on warriors, but on roots hidden in the ground, dried meat, and berries hidden under the snow. It was an annual battle for calories in which food storage engineering was more important than military tactics. Watch the video to the end to learn how a bitter root that we consider a weed saved entire villages from starvation, and what secret ingredient turned simple dried meat into the perfect fuel for survival. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of survival on the Great Plains, one that Europeans could not figure out for centuries. Pemmican was not just food, but a strategic resource, the basis of mobility for plains tribes such as the Lakota in Cheyenne. It was concentrated energy that allowed hunting and military parties to cover vast distances without stopping to cook. The preparation of pemmican was a long and laborious process involving the entire community, mainly women. A mistake in the drying or storage process could ruin the entire supply, threatening the survival of the group. It was a real science, passed down from generation to generation. The basis of pemmican was bison meat, but not just any meat, only the leanest. Fat was the enemy during the drying stage, as it could go rancid and spoil the product. The meat was cut into very thin, almost transparent slices called tas in lieu. These slices were hung on wooden frames under the scorching sun of the plains or smoked over a slow fire. The drying process took several days and required constant supervision. After complete drying, the meat became as brittle as glass. It was placed on a skin and beaten with wooden hammers or stones, turning it into a fine powder. This powder was the base, but on its own it was too dry and tasteless. The secret lay in the following two ingredients, which turned it into a superfood. The second ingredient was melted bison fat, with fat from the kidney area being particularly prized. It was carefully melted over a low heat, separating out all impurities. This pure fat, or tallow, was a preservative and a source of calories. It was mixed with meat powder in a strictly defined proportion until the mixture became homogeneous. The third component, which added flavor and vitamins, was berries. Wild cherries or Saskatoon berries were most often used, which were also pre-dried and crushed. These berries not only enriched the flavor, but also served as an additional preservative due to their acid content. The mixture of meat powder, fat, and berries was called pemmican. The finished mixture was tightly packed into bags made of raw bison hide, called parfleche. The bag was sewn up, and the seams were filled with an additional layer of fat, creating an airtight package. In this form, pemmican could be stored for years without losing its properties. It was the perfect food for winter, when hunting became impossible. The nutritional value of this product was remarkable. A small piece of pemmican, about the size of a fist, could sustain an adult warrior for a whole day of hard travel. It did not require cooking and could be eaten on the go, breaking off pieces as needed. In winter, it was sometimes crumbled into hot water to make a nutritious broth. We would love to hear your opinion. Do you think pemmican can be considered one of the first energy bars in human history? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss stories about other ingenious inventions of indigenous peoples. Are you ready to learn the truth about rice that isn't actually rice, but was valued more than gold in the icy lands of the subarctic? Manomin, or wild rice, is actually the seed of a tall aquatic grass that grows in the shallow waters of lakes and rivers in the Great Lakes region and subarctic forests. For people such as the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, and Cree, this product was not just food, but a sacred gift. Harvesting wild rice was an important ritual and social event that determined the well-being of the community for the entire coming winter. The harvest, or rising, took place in late summer and early fall, before the frost set in. Two people paddled a canoe through the shallow water. One person at the stern steered the boat with a long pole, taking care not to damage the fragile stalks. The other, sitting in the center, used two sticks called knockers to bend the stalks over the side of the canoe and gently knock out the ripe grains. An important part of the process was that not all the grains were harvested. Some of them fell back into the water, ensuring a harvest for the following year. This was an example of early sustainable land use based on a deep respect for the resource. The harvesters passed through the same area several times as the grains ripened unevenly. The harvested rice was brought to the camp, where the long processing process began. First, it was spread out on skins or mats to dry in the sun. This was an important step, as damp grains quickly became covered with mold. In rainy weather, the rice could be dried on racks over a very slow fire. After drying, the grains had to be roasted to remove the outer husk and give them their characteristic smoky aroma. The rice was placed in large metal cauldrons in later times, or clay pots in the pre-contact period, and constantly stirred over the fire. This process required great skill so as not to burn the grain. The next stage was treading the rice. The roasted grains were poured into a pit lined with deerskin or into a large wooden vat. Men wearing special moose skin shoes, moccasins, rhythmically trampled on the grain. The friction separated the husk from the kernel. After that, the rice was winnowed, tossed in the wind in shallow trays or baskets. The wind carried away the light husks, and the heavy, clean grains fell back into the tray. This process was repeated several times until a perfectly clean product was obtained. Wild rice was a reliable but stationary resource that required a settled lifestyle. What do you think was the basis of survival for nomadic peoples who did not have the opportunity to create such large reserves? In the next chapter, we will talk about a people who turned corn storage into a true art form. What if I told you that everything you knew about corn was wrong, and that its true purpose was not in the ears, but in the flour stored for months in the frozen ground? For the peoples of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, or Iroquois, who lived in longhouses in the forests of the Northeast, agriculture was the basis of life. Their civilization was built on the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash. But growing the crop was only half the battle. The real art was preserving it for the long, harsh winter. The Iroquois were masters of selection, breeding dozens of varieties of corn. A special place was occupied by flint corn. Its kernels were very hard, almost like stone, and covered with a tough shell. This variety was not very good for fresh consumption, but it had exceptional shelf life and was resistant to pests. In the fall after the harvest, women wove the cobs into long garlands using the remaining leaves. These garlands were hung under the roofs of long houses. The smoke from the hearths, constantly rising upward, saturated the cobs, further drying them and protecting them from insects. But the main secret of storage was underground storage facilities, or kesi pits. These were not just holes in the ground, but complex engineering structures. Men dug deep, bell-shaped pits in well-drained soil, often on a small hill. The walls and bottom of the pit were carefully burned with fire. This made the soil hard and sterile, killing plant, roots, and insects. The pit was then lined with dry grass and large pieces of bark, most often elm, creating a waterproof and breathable layer. Threshed and thoroughly dried corn was poured into these prepared pits. It was packed down so tightly that as little air as possible remained inside. Dried beans and dried pumpkin, cut into rings, the other two sisters, were also placed in the pits. The pits were filled to the top, covered with another layer of bark and grass, and then covered with soil and carefully camouflaged with turf. The frost that bound the top layer of soil served as additional protection from wild animals and enemies. These storage facilities were almost invisible. This combination of agriculture, storage engineering, and food chemistry allowed the Iroquois to create one of the most powerful societies in pre-Columbian America. If you are also impressed by this system, please like this video. Guess what made Indigenous women voluntarily wade waist-deep into icy water in winter? The answer may surprise you. Wapato, also known as Indian potato or arrowhead, was one of the most important starchy root vegetables for many tribes. This aquatic plant produces edible tubers that are similar in taste and texture to regular potatoes. Its value lay in the fact that it could be harvested in late fall and even early winter. Wapato tubers grow at the ends of long stolen roots submerged in the mud at the bottom of ponds, lakes, and swamps. In the fall, when the above-ground part of the plant dies, the tubers reach their maximum size. They remained in the mud throughout the winter and were not affected by frost. Harvesting Wapato was exclusively women's work. Women would wade into the cold water, sometimes breaking through thin ice. They would search for tubers in the mud by touch, using their feet. Once they found a tuber, they would push it out of the silt with their feet. The tubers, being lighter than water, floated to the surface, where they were collected in woven baskets. This harvesting method, known as treading, was hard work, requiring endurance and a tolerance for the cold. Women spent hours on end in the icy water. The harvested tubers were brought back to camp. They were covered in mud, but underneath it was white, crispy flesh. Wapato could be eaten raw, and it tasted like a water chestnut. However, the tubers were most often cooked. They were boiled to make a hearty puree or baked in hot ashes. Cooked Wapato became soft, floury, and slightly sweet. This root vegetable required a tremendous effort to harvest in icy water. Do you think there were other, more accessible winter root vegetables? In the next chapter, we will talk about a plant that could be found literally underfoot. Jerusalem artichoke, or topinambur, has nothing to do with Jerusalem or artichokes. This plant, belonging to the sunflower family, is native to North America. Indigenous peoples, especially in the east and central parts of the continent, valued it for its edible tubers, which were an important winter food. The uniqueness of Jerusalem artichoke lies in its chemical composition. Unlike potatoes, it stores energy not in the form of starch, but in the form of inulin. Inulin is a complex carbohydrate that is not directly digestible by humans. However, with the onset of cold weather, the inulin in the tubers gradually turns into fructose. This means that tubers left in the ground for the winter become sweeter with each frost. For indigenous peoples, it was a real natural pantry. Jerusalem artichokes did not need to be dug up in the fall and stored. They were simply left in the ground in the fields where they grew. In winter, when food was needed, women would go out with digging sticks and extract fresh, sweet tubers from under the snow and frozen ground. This was a huge advantage. There was no need to spend time harvesting, drying, and protecting the crop from rodents. The ground itself served as an ideal storage facility, which also improved the taste of the product. Jerusalem artichoke tubers could be eaten raw. They were crunchy, juicy, and sweet, with a nutty flavor. They were a valuable source of fresh vitamins in the middle of winter. Most often, of course, they were cooked. The tubers were boiled, baked in ashes, or roasted on hot stones. They became soft and acquired a rich, sweetish taste. Jerusalem artichokes were also added to soups and stews. Their sweet, starchy texture perfectly complemented salty dried meat or fish. It was a healthy and filling food. European colonists quickly appreciated this product. They were amazed by the plant's endurance and its ability to grow in any soil. It was they who brought Jerusalem artichoke to Europe, where it got its confusing name. For indigenous peoples, Jerusalem artichoke was a symbol of resilience. It served as a reminder that even in the harshest winter, the earth holds sweetness and life within it. One only needed to know where to dig. What if I told you that a plant you considered to be a common coastal weed was actually a universal store for survival? Cattail, which many mistakenly call reed, was one of the most valuable plants for indigenous peoples. It was called the supermarket of the marsh because virtually every part of this plant was useful. But it was especially valuable in winter as a source of food. The main winter product of cattail was its rhizomes, or roots. These are long, thick, rope-like roots that spread across the bottom of the marsh. They are rich in starch and available year-round. In winter, when the marsh froze over, men would break through the ice and use long sticks with hooks on the end to pull these rhizomes out from under the ice. It was hard work, but it guaranteed food when other sources were unavailable. The harvested rhizomes were covered with silt, but inside they contained a white, fibrous, starchy core. These rhizomes could be simply chewed raw, sucking out the nutritious juice and spitting out the fibers. But more often they were cooked. The rhizomes were baked whole in hot ashes. Under the influence of heat, the starch turned into a sweet, sticky mass. The shell was removed and the inside was eaten. However, the most common method was to make flour. The rhizomes were thoroughly washed, cleaned, and dried over a fire. Then they were ground in a mortar and pestle into a powder. This powder was sifted and washed in water. The heavy starch settled to the bottom, and the fibers floated to the top. The water was drained, and the remaining white pure starch was dried. This cattail flour was very nutritious. It was used to thicken soups, making them more filling. Mixed with fat, it was used to bake small flatbreads on stones. But cattails provided more than just flour. The fluffy inflorescences that appear in summer were used as tinder for lighting fires, and the dry leaves were used to make mats, baskets, and insulation for winter dwellings. Cattail was a reliable source of carbohydrates, but it could not provide the most important thing: sweetness. What food became the first celebration after a long winter? In the next chapter, we will learn about the sweet tree. At the end of a long and hungry winter, when supplies were running low and new greenery had not yet appeared, a special season began in the forests of the Northeast. Peoples such as the Iroquois and Anishinaabe eagerly awaited this moment. It was time to harvest maple sap, the first gift of the new year. The collection of sap began at a time when the nights were still frosty and the days were getting warm. This temperature difference caused the sap stored in the roots to rise up the trunk of the sugar maple. People watched nature closely, waiting for this weeping of the trees. Men made V-shaped cuts in the trunks with stone or bone tools. A wooden trough or piece of bark was inserted into the base of the cut. The sap flowed down this trough into containers placed underneath. The containers used were skillfully made buckets from birch bark, sewn together with roots and sealed with resin. These buckets were light and waterproof. Women walked around the trees collecting the sap in large vessels. The sap itself is slightly sweet water and cannot be stored for long. To turn it into a valuable product, it had to be boiled down. Here, the indigenous peoples showed remarkable ingenuity as they did not have metal cauldrons. They poured the sap into large wooden troughs. Then they heated stones in the fire and threw them into the sap with wooden tongs. The stones gave off their heat, the water evaporated, and the syrup became thicker. This process was repeated over and over, replacing the cooled stones with new hot ones. It was painstaking work that took hours, sometimes days. Gradually, the syrup thickened to the consistency of honey. But the Iroquois went further. They continued to boil the syrup until it crystallized. The result was hard maple sugar. It was broken off in pieces or stored in powder form. This sugar was not just a treat. It was an important preservative and source of energy. It was added to wild rice and corn porridge and used to season meat. It was a valuable commodity in trade between tribes. Maple sugar was the first celebration after a long winter. It gave people energy and hope, signaling that the cold was receding and a new life was about to begin. We mentioned snow berries, and this is no coincidence. Many berries become edible or even more delicious only after they have been hit by frost. One such vital berry was the viburnum, often referred to as the high-bush cranberry. These bright red berries ripen in late summer, but when fresh, they are very tart and bitter. Most animals leave them alone. As a result, the berries remain on the branches throughout the fall and early winter. The secret of viburnum is that after several cycles of freezing and thawing, its taste changes dramatically. The bitterness disappears, the tartness softens, and the berries become sweet and sour. Frost breaks down the complex tannins, making them edible. For the peoples of the subarctic and northern forests, such as the Kori, these berries were a real salvation. When the ground was covered with deep snow and hunting was unsuccessful, the bright red clusters of viburnum were clearly visible from afar. Women knocked the frozen berries off the bushes into baskets. These berries were hard as ice balls. They were brought home and either eaten frozen or allowed to thaw. Viburnum was not only a source of sugar, but also a powerful source of vitamin C. In the middle of winter, when the diet consisted mainly of dried meat and fat, this vitamin was vital for preventing scurvy. The berries were not only eaten fresh, they were crushed together with fat and dried meat to create a type of pemmican that was especially popular in the forest zone. The acid in the berries helped preserve the fat. The berries were also boiled to make a thick, sour sauce. This sauce was served with roasted moose or deer meat, which not only improved the taste but also aided digestion. Indigenous peoples also valued viburnum for its medicinal properties. A decoction of the bark and berries was used to relieve spasms and as a general tonic. It was not just food, but a whole pharmacy on a branch. Thus, what seemed inedible in summer turned into a delicacy and medicine in winter. Viburnum taught people patience and the knowledge that every product has its right time. Although pemmican was the pinnacle of plains food technology, its production was complex and not always necessary. The basis for it, and a product in its own right, was simple dried meat, which the Lakota called tassin-lu. It was the simplest and most ancient method of preserving protein. The production of tassin-lu began immediately after a successful bison hunt, which usually took place in the summer or fall. The carcass was cut up with incredible speed and skill. The meat was separated from the bones and, most importantly, from the fat. The leanest parts of the carcass were selected for drying. The meat was cut into very thin, long strips following the grain. The thickness of the slices was critically important. Pieces that were too thick did not dry out and rotted, while those that were too thin crumbled. These long strips of meat were hung on wooden racks or simply thrown over poles. Drying took place in the open air, in the hot, dry wind of the Great Plains. The sun and wind quickly removed moisture from the meat. The drying process took several days. At night, the meat was often removed or covered with skins to prevent it from getting damp from the dew. In rainy weather, it could be lightly smoked over a slow fire, which gave it additional flavor and preservative properties. Properly dried meat was light, firm, and almost black. It could be stored for months without losing its properties. It was placed in leather bags and stored in a dry place in a teepee. In winter, tassin-lu was essential for survival. It could be eaten as is by breaking off and chewing hard pieces. It was a long process, but it satisfied hunger well during long journeys. Most often, dried meat was used to make soup. It was thrown into a pot of water, wild herbs were added, and, if available, a little flour from cattail or Wapato. During cooking, the meat softened and gave the broth its rich flavor. Tassin-lu was not only food but also currency. It was exchanged for corn from farming tribes or for European goods. It was a stable, transportable, and nutritious product. In fact, modern jerky is a direct descendant of tassin-lu. However, the original product did not contain salt, sugar, or spices. It was pure, concentrated protein, ideally suited for nomadic life. We have talked about food reserves, sugar, and root vegetables. But what happened when all these reserves were running low? In the icy forests of the subarctic, where the Athabascans and Cree lived, there came a time known as the Hungry Moon. During these desperate weeks, usually at the very end of winter, when hunting was unsuccessful and the pemmican and dried fish supplies had been eaten, people turned to the last available resource, trees. They began to eat the bark, but not the outer bark. Their target was the cambium, a thin, living layer of tissue just beneath the hard outer bark. This layer is responsible for the tree's growth and thickness, and in the spring, nutrients move through it. In winter, it was the last source of calories. They chose certain trees. Most often, these were pines, spruces, birches, and aspens. Using an axe or knife, they made an incision and carefully removed the outer layer of bark, exposing the pale, moist cambium. This inner layer was scraped off the trunk in long strips. When raw, it was fibrous, slightly slimy, and had a resinous but slightly sweet taste. It could be chewed to satisfy acute hunger. However, cambium was more often cooked to make it more digestible. The strips were boiled in water to make a thick, starchy soup. It wasn't the most delicious food, but it was hot and provided at least some calories. Another method was to dry the cambium. The strips were dried by the fire until they became brittle. Then they were ground in a mortar to produce a kind of flour. This bark flour was mixed with leftover regular flour, if there was any, or simply with water and fat. Small, heavy flatbread was baked from this mixture on coals. It was real survival bread. The use of bark was a sign of extreme hunger. It was heavy on the stomach, but it allowed people to hold out until spring, until the first fish or the beginning of the maple sap flow. This example shows incredible resilience and a deep knowledge of nature. The indigenous peoples of the subarctic knew that even in the seemingly dead winter forest, food could be found if you knew where to look. It was the last line of defense in the battle against hunger. We have looked at 10 amazing foods that helped the indigenous peoples of North America survive the harshest winters, from the concentrated fuel of the plains, pemmican, to starchy roots harvested from under the ice, and sweet maple sugar. Each of these strategies was an ingenious response to the challenges posed by nature. What other aspects of indigenous peoples' daily life or survival would you like to see on our channel? Perhaps you are interested in their winter clothing, dwellings, or hunting methods. Suggest topics for future videos in the comments and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our new research.